Hello, everybody. My name is Lily Cole, and like you've heard, I am 14 years old. I think it's kind of impressive personally. Never would I have ever imagined myself a 14-year-old TEDx speaker. I am the youngest here today, and I'm pretty proud of that. Now, my entire talk, my entire spiel can be summed up into one phrase. You just never know. Now, I know you might not understand exactly what that means yet, but I promise I'll get to it. But I feel it's important you understand some things about me first. The first ever school I went to was a dual-language, inner-city Montessori school in Denver. Here, the school was half Spanish-speaking students and half English-speaking students, but we all learned in both languages. This school was insanely diverse. It had people of different ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. We had immigrant students and teachers. We had students and teachers of different citizenship statuses. We had students and teachers with two moms. But most of all, it was socioeconomically diverse. We had people that were the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor who all came together in one building. Now, something that was very important to the school was the acceptance of all people. People didn't have to be rich. People didn't have to drive that fancy sports car. You didn't have to have pale skin, and you did not have to practice Christianity. You were you, and the differences that were in you was the thing that people were fascinated with. The things that made you an individual, the things that made you unique, were the things people were interested in learning about. They didn't care how much money you had. They didn't care if you lived with 7 people or if you lived in a mansion all by yourself. What mattered was what made you, you. And I think that's pretty cool. Flash forward a decade or so, my family moves out to the burbs. And I'm sure you can imagine how different this was. Everything in the suburbs was extremely homogeneous. From the food, to the architecture, to the people, it was so similar to each other, I felt lost. I felt lost in a place where everything looked the same. And I think that because it was so opposite of what I had been used to, it wasn't what I was expecting, and it wasn't what I had wanted. But it's what I got, so that's what I had to deal with. And people in the suburbs were so focused on being on top of the same box, better than each other at the same things. Nobody thought to think outside of the box. It wasn't long before I started getting crap for being who I was. Korean and Jewish. You heard from a Jewican today, now it's your local Jurian. The first time I was ever called a kike was at a school here in Littleton. And to let that sink in, at the time, I didn't even know what that meant. Some kid walked up to me, "Hey, kike." I was like, "Whoa, excuse me. I don't know what that means, but I know it's derogatory." And I had called my dad. I was like, "Dad, what does kike mean?" Within 5 minutes, he was like, skirt, up to my school. He was marching up to my school, hands closed and fists, eyes bugging out. He had his jaw clenched and that little vein bulging out of his head. And, well, we just had a talk with the principal, and everything turned out okay, so I thought it was going to get better. But it just got worse from there. On top of being called a kike, chink, half-breed, rhymes were made up about me, such as, and I quote, "Ching chong, your religion is wrong." And when is that ever okay? Ask yourself, when is that ever okay? The answer is it's never okay. But again, it's what I had to deal with. And that isn't okay either. I felt so angry. I felt like the louder my voice got, the louder the other side got too. The more confident I acted, the weaker I felt. And I was so angry at the fact that I had to choose between being in a place where we were safe and being in a place where we were happy. Granted, not everything was bad, I will admit. Again, we were safe, and we never had to worry about the possibility of a drunk dude being passed out in front of our house. The schools were also better funded, which meant we got a good education. But I still could not help but feel I would never, ever, ever belong in this building. I found myself hating the area I lived in, hating the people I went to school with, having resentment towards the white, Christian, conservative people who tormented me day in and day out. So, I do know what it's like to be the hated, but I also know what it's like to be the hater. And neither of which are very much fun at all. Now, pay attention here, because this is where that phrase comes in again. You just never know. I was first told this by my dad when we were driving down in downtown Denver. I don't know what had gone on, but I think I was making fun of a kid, and he looked at me and he was like, "You don't know." And I was like, what? And he goes, "You don't know what that kid has to go home to. You don't know who that kid is. You don't know what they are going through, what goes on behind closed doors, and you don't know who they will become. They could be your boss 20 years' time. You know their face and their name, and that is it. You just never know." Now, a good example of this that you have seen today can be brought in with Joe Chavez, who was a speaker you heard earlier. Like he mentioned, he went to San Fernando High School, and there was a kid he played sports with, and they were always going back and forth, like teasing each other, so much that eventually that became their relationship, and instead of it being negative, it was like, that's my bro. The other person, you might have heard of him. His name is George Lopez. You just never know. Now, you might not know what they're going through now, and you might not know what they will go through, but you also don't know what they have gone through. You just don't know. So now you know this concept of not knowing, but how can we apply it into our lives? You can't control the rest of the world. I can't control the people who call me a kike. I cannot control the people who make up those rhymes about me. I cannot control anybody but myself. And for me, this idea was more or less of a way of living and more of just a coping mechanism, something that got me through the day. And I think that the first step towards applying this into your life is checking yourself. Unconscious bias is learned behavior that are automatic, unintentional, deeply ingrained, and able to influence behavior. They are stereotypes. So, when someone at school says, "I'm not racist," after saying something completely race-based and offensive, I believe you. You aren't racist. You're just ignorant. And that's what unconscious bias is. This is when someone assumes that all black people are natural athletes, or all Asians are good at math, or white people can't dance. Going through school, I always had those questions, being the kid whose parents had to work multiple jobs just to stay in the area I was in. No, I do not have AirPods. No, I do not have a fancy car. Yes, I am Asian. And no, I cannot do your math homework. So if someone lives and grew up with a bunch of diversity, they are more likely to see diverse people as mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents, people. Whereas someone who didn't grow up around a bunch of diversity and all they know is the stereotypes and the media they have grown up with, they are more likely to see a person of color as the surface of what they know. simply because of what they look like. And I believe that is something that we might not be able to control in everyone, but we can sure as heck control it in ourselves. The same goes the opposite way. I feel like we are so quick to acknowledge one way, but then the opposite isn't the same. If you grew up around a bunch of diversity and not many white people, you might see a white person and have those prejudgments as well. And they're never correct, never, from all sides. So acknowledging the fact that yes, in a white suburban Littleton, we are more likely to have unconscious bias than in an area with more diversity. And we can check that in ourselves, because where we may not be able to control how many black people, how many Mexican people, how many Asians are in the area we live in, we can control how we perceive one another. Now, once you make these adjustments in yourself and fix these habits, these snap judgments, you can start to spread it to your children, students, coworkers, siblings. But how do we do that? How do we educate one another? I've come to learn that people learn best of one of two things: experience and stories about experience. I'm pretty sure most every TED speaker today has shared either a personal narrative or a narrative from an idol today, and then that's when you tune in, isn't it? So if you would like to teach your kids or your students, especially students, as an educator, you have to think of a time in your life where maybe someone didn't know something about you, or maybe you didn't know something about someone else, or it could be another kid you grew up with. Tell that story. We have a way of figuring out the rest ourselves. Taking little bits of information and painting a big picture is in our human nature. So if we teach each other to just recognize that you only have this tiny bit of information, and that's okay, you don't have to fill in the rest of the picture, that's the beginning of educating. Educate yourself as well on topics such as unconscious bias or systemic racism, or even small things that you can see in your day-to-day life. And make sure that people understand this while they're still young, because when we're young, our brains are more easily moldable. Before they become habits, teach them while they're young. You can't hide from the world. It's there. Don't try and pretend that things don't exist. Like, no, never in my neighborhood, never in my school. Yes, in every neighborhood, in every school, no matter where you live. Acknowledge these and remind yourself that they exist, and tell your kids, your students, your siblings that they exist, because you can't ignore them for the rest of your life. And, say what you want to say. You can be a hater all you want. I'm not here to control you. You can be as mean to another kid or another person or your coworker as much as you want to. But just know in the back of your mind, there's a whole other side of things that you cannot see. When I think about it, if I was truly given the opportunity to get to know you, I just might like you. And if you were really, truly given the chance to get to know me, you might like me back. You just never know. Thank you.